It's a delight to be there. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me, and I think you should all be very thankful to the organisers as well for not putting me either before or just after lunch, because there will be some photos in here that won't be pleasant. Starting with the situation that we're all about to embark on, right? Lovely Christmas dinner. Super excited about this already. And at some point, you might notice that, what is that, right? There's the awkward, stanky bit of just unpleasantness on the dinner table as well. And this inspires in you something that's quite visceral, right? And for all of you Sprouts lovers in the audience, I have a slightly different example. So this is basically all I need to summarize my entire talk. There's a few things that happen when you see this. The first thing you notice is that it's disgusting, right? I've seen quite a few kind of look away, so you try to avoid whatever's going on in a disgusting scenario. The other thing that happens is you potentially feel something in your stomach, right? This makes you actively a bit queasy. There's a visceral element to disgust. And another element to this, which I'll come back to all the way at the back, is that children are inherently disgusting. Children are gross. This is mine. I can say that about this child, but there's something there that we'll come back to at the end. So you might be wondering, did people actually research this? And the answer is yes, but very, very limited. So this is the number of publications in the y-axis over time on the x-axis for the core emotions that we consider to be important. The purple line all the way up top is fear. The next biggest line in red is anger. And I think this tells you something about the funding climate in the UK, that we're all kind of in this phase of research. Just to point out, the brown line on the bottom, that's disgust. And for like a little quick reference, this is the number of papers on bananas every year. It's about twice as much. So few people do this. And that's a shame, because it's a very, very important emotion. It's in fact such an important emotion that we see it in our closest genetic cousins as well. So this is a study, brilliant study done by Céline Serabien. She works in bonobos, but also chimpanzees. This one is on bonobos. And what we essentially see is her experimental setup on the bottom. That is a fresh slice of poo, with on top of that and adjacent to fresh slices of banana. And these bonobos, they like eating banana. And as you can see in the bar graph, the likelihood of them eating something is on there. So basically, what we see is that the further away from the poo, the more likely bonobos are to eat that slice of banana. But also, somewhat worryingly, about 30 to 50% of bonobos is very happy eating the slices on top of and directly adjacent to. But you can imagine, on a survival note, not the best idea, right? Because you can eat that, it can be contaminated, you might develop some gastrointestinal illness and die. So we see this kind of disgust avoidant behavior in bonobos, but not too much. And in humans, it is supercharged. So this is another actual study that people actually did. This is a bit of the method section, because I always feel that it's very funny how they advertise the study. So this is Paul Rosen and colleagues, and in one of the sub-experiments in this particular study, what they do is they give people a piece of high quality, they felt the need to stress that, chocolate fudge. And the chocolate fudge is shaped in a surprisingly realistic piece of dog feces, actual quote. And the idea is that you can offer this to people after they've had a little taste of the fudge already in a slightly different shape, and people will refuse. People do not eat this chocolate fudge that's shaped like a surprisingly realistic piece of dog feces. And that's very interesting. Like it's something that doesn't actually do any kind of damage to you. It's perfectly safe to eat. It just looks like something that is a bit gross. And we, at least in anthropology, I say we, I'm not an anthropologist, but we in science, we kind of put this down to sympathetic magic, specifically laws of contagion and laws of similarity. The idea that once something was in contact, it's always in contact, contagion, and also things that very much look like something that you shouldn't be eating, like a surprisingly realistic piece of dog feces, that is also something that we want to avoid eating altogether. And the reason that we have this, and not just we as like modern industrialized humans, you can find this in modern hunter-gatherers as well, who are a very poor proxy for past hunter-gatherers because they're modern humans in their own right, but the closest proxy that we have. So this seems to be something that's fundamentally human. It's not just something that's post-industrial revolution. This is built into all of us. And the reason we think we have that is evolutionary very beneficial, right? It's a bit like a fire alarm. It goes off all the time without there actually being a fire, but it's okay. Those false alarms are great because you don't want to miss any actual real fire. And in disgust, that's very similar. The worst thing that can happen is that you pass on a meal, typically not the worst case scenario. Sorry, that's the worst, not actually the worst, the very worst thing that can happen if you have a miss is that you die, right? Gastrointestinal illnesses are things that have killed quite a few humans in the past, and therefore you really want to avoid that. So this is something that's built as a very adaptive response in the past anyways. What we see in the current kind of environment is that sometimes disgust is still very adaptive. You smell that sandwich before you eat it. In other cases, it's maladaptive. There are types of psychopathologies that start with a little too much disgust. So there's subtypes of OCD, particularly the cleaning associated ones, where sometimes the path into it is through excessive disgust. Other aspects that carry some disgust are specific phobias. Some arachnophobes are just fearful of spiders. They're actually grossed out by them as well. And there are certain PTSDs. And sitting across from Tim Dalmaijer, who knows a lot more about that than I do, but there's a few origins of PTSD, like the events that you then have a trauma about, that are particularly disgusting in nature. And all of those are really, really hard to tackle because the tools that we have in our clinician's box don't really work on them. We basically say that they're cognitively impenetrable, which is so much to say as the brain doesn't fully seem to tackle them. It's not just in psychopathology, by the way, there are many people who work with very disgusting things on a daily basis. And ideally, cleaners, physicians, and ideally you want to overcome that disgust. And that's kind of the driving idea behind all of the research that I'm going to show you. But before we go into that, I first want to take you through how we quantify disgust in a lab, because it's one thing to just show you a gross photo and see roughly how you respond. It's another thing altogether to actually measure that in a sensible way in the lab. And the way that we do that is the stupidest way possible. We show things on the screen and we use an eye tracker or some fancy online software to do an analogous thing of that. And we just see where people look when we present them with stimuli. This is my collaborator Thomas Armstrong for Whitman and my former PhD student Alex, who did the mouse thing that I'm about to show you. But basically, we show two images on the screen. All of the dots are people looking at the screen. And what you primarily see is that people tend to avoid the giant honking turd that's there, right? That's very stupid, right? If I were to ask you how would people do in this situation, this is exactly what you would say. And yes, it works really well. And if I can get away with doing stupid experiments and getting paid for it, yeah, that's actually my preferred way of doing things. Just to show you, if we have like an online adaptation of this with mouse tracking on the bottom, we see a very similar thing. So that's a nice analogy to eye movement patterns. And the idea is essentially we avoid disgusting things. This is what that looks like if you reduce it into a single plot. On the x-axis, we have time into a trial, and on the y-axis, we have essentially a preference for the neutral stimulus or the disgusting stimulus. And what we see is that there's an initial bit of approach, maybe some curiosity as to what's that over there, and then immediate avoidance following that. You can call it morbid curiosity if you want to, but the main thing that's interesting for us is that there's avoidance that's stable and continues throughout the rest of the trial. That's very different from other negatively valenced emotions. You can do this a few times with things like fear, or there's a few things where we've tried suicide adjacent imagery for complex reasons, but the bottom line is it was also a very negatively valenced thing, and people tend to avoid it initially and then kind of don't really care anymore afterwards. So they go back to baseline. The only other emotion where you see something more sustained is kind of happiness. If you show pleasanter images, people approach them a bit more. So basically, disgust is in its own like unique little quadrant of behavior with this consistent avoidance essentially. So this is a nice way to measure disgust in a lab, and now we can take that measure to see whether we can overcome disgust. And the first thing we did was, again, very stupid experiment. We just take the same photos, the very same two photos, and we show them to you over and over and over and over and over again, literally 24 times in a row. At this point, you've looked at the same two photos for like 5 minutes in total. You think excessive boredom sets in, people completely habituate to this. And yet, this on the x-axis is number of trials, so 24 in total. On the y-axis, the approach to several stimuli, the neutral ones in green, the disgusting ones in yellow. And people just show that sustained avoidance of disgusting stimuli. Again, the very same stimuli, right? So this is very weird. It just doesn't seem to habituate, at least not in the shortish term. So the next thing we thought, you know what, every other problem is solved in this way. We're just going to chuck money at it. What we're doing is measuring where people look.
Please try again.
We're just measuring where people look. And whilst they're looking at the disgusting stimuli, we give them a little bit of money. So every 4 to 8 seconds, they get 25 cents. This is cents because it's American population. And this is what happens when you do that. Turns out students will happily do anything for 25 cents. So that lasts for about 10 seconds. We do this for several trials in a row. So at the end of this, people have spent at least like about 5 minutes actively looking at these disgusting photos, right? So you could argue maybe originally they were avoiding them and therefore you have less contact. This is what we call incentivized exposure, and it really works, right? Just in a graph to show you the same thing, we have the pre-measurement, disgust avoidance, the during measurement rather. Everyone looks at the poo. And then the question is, does that change their affinity to the stimulus? After this, if we show the exact same stimuli again, are they still avoidant? Yes, they are. In fact, we've made it slightly worse, it almost seems like. So that's sad. We can't do short-term disgust avoidance using just these kind of exposure methods. There might be a few people in the audience who are like, well, I, on a personal basis, deal with disgust quite a lot, and I feel that I've kind of overcome this. Maybe I work in an institution where I clean the toilets, or where I dig into people's bowels, or where I do other things that are quite disgusting. Maybe I'm a parent and have to deal with that, like snotty nose all the time. So one of the research questions that we addressed in our lab with Charlotte Edgar, who herself used to work in care homes, FHM, is basically that question, right? Do people who are much longer term exposed to disgusting things, do they habituate? So this is our control group. We have 2 sets of stimuli. In green, we have disgusting things that are related to what we euphemistically call bodily effluvia. Think poo, sick, snot, that kind of stuff. One of the nice things about doing this kind of research is I can stand in front of a serious audience and talk about poo, sick, and snot, and nobody bats an eye. The other type of stimulus that we showed in red here is what we euphemistically call body envelope violations. So these are things that are normally on the inside of the body and are now on the outside and arguably shouldn't be, right? So this is blood, bodily harm, the things you find in care homes that are particularly unpleasant. I won't give you too many details. And what we essentially see in our control group is they avoid these stimuli quite substantially. It's not as strong as the other ones. It turns out if you show people poo, very strong disgust avoidance response. Other stimuli are a bit more varied, but the bottom line is overall, they show avoidance on both of these 2 things. And one of our main questions was, these stimuli are all related to things you find in the care home. Wounds that people develop when they lie in bed for a long time, toilets, they're absolutely destroyed, those kind of things. And the main question then is, do care home workers avoid these things more or less than other people? And they show essentially no avoidance whatsoever. So there's a bit of variability on this, but statistically, all of those avoidance patterns are indistinguishable on 0. So they have no preference anymore for the disgusting or for the neutral stimulus. Seems to be that they thus are habituated, much more so than the control group. The next question we had was, fine, you've habituated to your very local circumstance, all of the adult pads that you're changing, that doesn't really bother you anymore. But stimuli outside of that context, are you also generalizing your habituation to disgust to those kind of stimuli? So dog feces you might find in the street. In the control group, we did the experiment again, body envelope violations in orange this time, gore disgust, bodily effluvia in blue, and you still see the avoidance response. Very boring. Controls are always showing avoidance. And the real question here was, do care home workers also show that avoidance still? And the answer was no. They also are indistinguishable in 0 there. So that's really interesting. It basically shows you that within the context that you're habituating to disgust, you're not really showing avoidance, but it also generalizes beyond that. Whereas there's no reason that care home workers would come into contact with dog turds on the street as much as anyone else, right? So that's really interesting, and essentially shows that despite us not really getting there in the lab, you can get there in the long term. But there's a little bit of space in between there because these care home workers, they've worked in care homes for months to years. And there was also a correlation with the disgust sensitivity and how long they've worked in a care home. So it seems to be that they are adapting to their circumstance, or the slightly less charitable interpretation is that people kind of quit their jobs if they don't cope well with their circumstance, right? So the next thing we're trying to address is why, in some humans who are not fully exposed to disgusting things all the time, does this not habituate? And in others, we see that slow decline. And therefore, we turn to the rest of the body. Because I said earlier, we are in a situation where disgust is cognitively impenetrable. We can't think our way out of seeing a very smelly turd. And this was news to me. I am trained as a psychologist. This is what a human looks like to me, a brain and a pair of eyes. And it turns out there are other organs in the body. That's really cool. And it turns out that some of the other organs you can actually measure things from as well. So what we do in the lab is we do electrogastrography. And the idea is essentially we place a reference sensor on the xiphoid process. It's basically the thing where your sternum ends. We also place a sensor slightly further down, roughly halfway between the umbilicum and the xiphoid process. And then there's a few more sensors around there. And those measure stomach activity. There's a pacemaker region in the stomach that works at a really slow rate. And that's the thing we're trying to pick up here. When I say we, these are the people in my lab that currently do that. And the way that the signal looks is this. So this is after a bunch of filtering and data magic. And the idea is essentially that this is an oscillation that we see in the stomach pacemaker region that runs at about 1 cycle every 20 seconds, 3 cycles per minute. So it's very slow compared to anything we see in the brain. What you can do to this signal is do a Fourier transform. You get this nice 3 cycles per minute peak out of there. So now we have something that we can test. This is called the normal gastric response. And in most people, it would look roughly like this. So lovely signal. And the idea in the literature is that when you have this signal under normal conditions, it's roughly like this. But when you have this signal under disgust, it looks roughly like this, where normal is pink and disgust is green. So it's an attenuation of that normal gastric response. So that's the kind of thing that we're after. If you want to read more about this, there's very few papers in the literature because, again, we publish much more on bananas than we do on disgust. But all of those things are really nicely reviewed by my PhD student, Samir Aladdin, with help from Ruth and Poppy. And the idea is essentially that of the literally 8 papers in existence, he found them all and reviewed them. And this is kind of the thing out there. Now, I do want to make a quick side note there that most of these are pretty small scale studies without necessarily the best kind of methods in terms of signal processing. So we are redoing a lot of this older work in the lab, but we also approach it from the opposite side. Specifically, we're going to chuck drugs at the stomach. And this is a brilliant idea from my friend and colleague Camilla Nord. The paper actually also, Tim Dalgleish and Kate Baker, both present, had a large contribution to. Camilla's idea was we have this kind of disgust that seems to be cognitively impenetrable and doesn't really habituate. We have a drug as well called domperidone. And domperidone is very special. It's a peripheral dopamine antagonist. So it doesn't really cross the blood-brain barrier. And we did some control experiments to make sure that we didn't have the standard kind of dopamine signature responses, and we didn't have any of those. So this is something that doesn't really act in the brain. What it does do is it settles your stomach. It normalizes those gastric rhythms back into 3 cycles per minute to their kind of normal state. So in this experiment, we did a pre-measurement, we gave people the drug, waited for a little bit, we do a post-measurement, and then we go through the incentivized exposure procedure again, where we again give people money for looking at poo, and that's A, because it's very funny, but also B, because it really forces them to engage with the stimulus, whereas otherwise they probably ignore it a little bit. And we really wanted the system to engage with the stimulus so that we could potentially notice any of those drug effects. So these graphs show the same as before. Green is the neutral stimulus, yellow is the disgusting stimulus. We see avoidance in both the pre on the left and the post measurement on the right. So this is basically the drug itself, which, by the way, the drug, the full line, and the placebo, the dashed line, the drug itself doesn't really do anything, right? So we pre and a post measurement, exactly the same, statistically indistinguishable. The drug in of itself doesn't really do anything. So then we run through the same incentivized exposure. We replicate our earlier findings where we see avoidance beforehand and a complete complete looking at the poo is what do you call that? Fecal obsession throughout the incentivized exposure. So this is again 30 seconds of people looking at poo very intently. They get 25 to pee every 4 to 8 seconds. And the idea is essentially now they've been on domperidone and they've really engaged with the stimulus. So the question is then, do we now finally start seeing a difference? And the answer to that is yes, statistically very much so. You can see that in the graph by the dashed lines going, the solid lines going slightly closer together, whereas the dashed lines stay where they are. So on placebo, you don't see this effect. On domperidone, you do. It's also a very subtle effect, right? It's a single dose, so you're probably not expecting too much. But it is a very promising kind of first step towards potentially coming up with something where we can bring this into more usable circumstances where we potentially use this drug to help people. Just to show you how incredibly subtle this effect is, this is what it looks like. This is after, while people are on the drug. So there's a little bit more shit staring going on, but not too much. All right. The final thing I wanted to get back to is kids, because again, kids are disgusting. They are objectively so, and that's supported by evidence that we have. On the left is parents responding to, when does your kid show any kind of disgust-related response? Turns out 3 to 5 is roughly where parents are indicating that. On the right, we see facial responses to discussing things in children starts roughly around 5-ish years of age. So it takes a solid while. And if we have in adults this really strong primacy of the stomach that seems to be the breaking element, right? If you see something disgusting, you avoid it because the stomach is telling you to do so. My expectation, at least, would have been in kids, that sounds like it should have been like a pre-built response, right? Whereas this kind of pattern seems very much to suggest that it's a learned response. So therefore, the next experiment that we're wanting to do is trying to guess at that. So it's this primacy of the stomach. Your brain sees something, because obviously stomach doesn't have eyes, see something disgusting, and it's your stomach that says, woo, pump the brakes. What we now wanted to know is whether this pre-exists or whether this is something that's learned, and therefore we take the children. We measure them in this kind of really nice, this is actually my adult disgust measuring lab. The chair is there. It's a famous IKEA chair. I'm sure every one of you will have had that in your dorms. The idea is essentially that people lie back quite nicely, which is better for the signal because there's less muscle involvement there. We also have that in a child size because it turns out IKEA makes them in really small measures as well. So we put children in there. We run them do the exact same thing as adults, but now we intersperse a little bit of Bluey every now and again, which is a children's cartoon to keep them engaged. For the rest, these experiments are the exact same between kids and adults. And if you asked, do kids avoid? Mind you, this graph is flipped from what I've showed you before. Everything on the top is kids showing ocular motor, as we call it, disgust avoidance. So they just try and look at the neutral more so than disgusting thing. On the x-axis, we have age. So outside of a few 10-year-olds on the left, 5-year-olds on the left, we have 5 all the way to 13. Outside of a few of those 5-year-olds and a few naughty 10-year-olds, we see mostly disgust avoidance. There's no real correlation between age and avoidance here. So what it looks like is that the behavioral disgust avoidance response is already there, which is kind of what you would predict on the basis of the earlier data, right? And now the next question is the gastric response also there? If it is, then that might actually be first. If it isn't yet, then it's probably a learned response that we then take with us over time. So again, we're expecting this kind of strong attenuation, and what we see is nothing like that. This is just the data scaled. Only in the very last plot towards age 13, you see some kind of difference there, and expressed as a correlation, it roughly looks like this. So age on the x-axis, avoidance on the y. On the whole, this is indistinguishable from 0, but you do see in like the dodgiest of correlations, just a threshold, probably not quite true. There might be another correlation here. But the bottom line is, kids don't really show that stomach response that you're expecting in adults quite yet. So it seems to be learned, right? In conclusion, disgust inspires avoidance in both kids and adults. The brain and the stomach communicate during this disgust, and it seems to be the stomach that pumps the brakes. And finally, children seem to learn this kind of visceral disgust response. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I am happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you. Great talk. I can't say I enjoyed it, but it was a great talk. I was interested in the care home data you had. Do you have any sense of, because there's sort of two things going on there, right? People enter this environment and they're exposed to things over time, but then there's also the choice to enter that environment in the first place. Do you have any sense of how much that discussed sort of lack of sensitivity is learned versus innate? Is that something you've been able to look at?
So we do know from studies in both medical students and in people who are in things like nursery and also meat processing, that there does indeed seem to be the lower you are in discuss sensitivity, the more likely you are to go into slightly grosser areas of study or slightly grosser kind of fields of work. So that definitely exists. We are currently running studies in parents to do a very similar thing, because obviously you're faced with all nappies and there are much more like uniform slices of population that's probably a bit less towards the disgust avoidance spectrum. So I think some of it is definitely something that existed before they decided to go into the trajectory, but even within the trajectory, you see that people become less and less disgust avoidant. And if you talk to them, they won't tell you it's pleasant or anything. They might have adapted to it a little bit, but they still don't necessarily enjoy it. And especially early on, that's very much the case. Innate, I wouldn't call it, because it seemed to be a learned response, but at the same time, it definitely is something that pre-exists. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Really interesting. I'm wondering about different forms of disgust. So, for example, moral disgust, or and how potentially we could kind of use these sorts of findings to address prejudice and things like issues like that.
Great question. There's a few different ways into that, and I typically try to avoid moral disgust because it's a bit of a minefield in terms of what the actual relations are to core disgust. This is much easier to do because the stomach is clearly involved. You don't want to see poo. You don't want to eat it. With moral disgust, people have made various claims. I think the best way of seeing it used in practice is in Valerie Curtis's work. She takes disgust-based messaging into different environments, both in low to middle income countries, where she's trying to increase hand washing with soap. But before we're too proud as high income countries, she's also done studies of restrooms at UK service stops, where the majority of people don't really wash their hands with soap. And what it looks like if you put some disgust-based messaging in those kind of bathrooms, whether you see an increase in hand washing with soap. So we do actually use it for Val Curtis used it for those kind of circumstances. In other scenarios, it's harder to see where this would work, because mostly it's discussed as blocking you from doing progressive things like insect eating, for example. Really nice source of protein that has fewer environmental implications than other sources of protein, where the idea of eating insects is a bit we're actually doing studies in the lab right now, specifically looking at that. Recycled wastewater is one of those where people just don't like the idea. And I think the real thing we need is getting over that disgust. So studies like ours, where we try to find out what undoes disgust in certain scenarios, I think are useful for that. There's other types of moral disgust that go more into exclusion of certain groups. I don't really know about that. It's not really my preferred area of study, but we can talk afterwards if you want to.
One more question.
Hi, thanks, excellent talk. I wonder, is there a familial aspect of this? Because you show the kids then, you look at it, but when you're changing your baby's nappies, you didn't mind changing your own baby's nappies, but if you're asked to do somebody else's baby's nappies, you're always like, no thanks.
Yeah.
Sort of thing. But also, even with a care home, if they're forming bonds with the person, so if you think about elderly care, so anybody's elderly parents, accidents happen, so you don't mind clearing, helping, and clearing up something. If that was somebody else's parent, you wouldn't do it. So I'm just wondering whether there is a familial disgust habituation.
100%. So there is definitely a reduction of how disgusted you are by situational kind of circumstances, and one of them is familiarity with the person or thing that produced the disgusting material. So you're less bothered by people that are closer to you. Body odor is a good example of that. There's actual studies on this. But yeah, changing your kids' nappies are probably along the same routes, and you're probably quite likely with the care homeworks as well. They bond with the people that they care for, and therefore they are less grossed out by it. Which is also why I was so surprised to find that generalizing finding, because I had not predicted that whatsoever. Charlotte was very much more clued in than I was, clearly, because she did predict it. So there's a little bit of familiarity, and there's also definitely the kind of overarching habituation there as well. But yeah, you're 100% right. There's a downgrading of more familiar people.
Yeah, I appreciate there are more questions, but I'll encourage you to catch everyone and Sophie at the coffee break. So thank you.